Right, we're live. I'd like to welcome everyone to Lecture 3 of Philosophy, Ideology, and History, a futuristic examination from modern Europe to W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, presented by the Saturday Free School. I'll begin by reading the call, as we've been doing throughout this series. War, poverty, white supremacy, and inequality consume the lives of billions throughout the world and the majority in our nation. The 1%, the oligarchs, and the ruling class generally are consumed in universal selfishness and hatred of the people. In times like these, the people ask, what can be done? Part of answering such a question turns us to ideas, philosophy, and ideology. For those who seek to know the world in order to change it, our time calls for a deep examination of society and its assumptions. We welcome all to a series of lectures and discussions led by Dr. Anthony Monteiro, which will address the great modern philosophers, including Descartes, Hegel, Marx, and conclude with the philosophies of those in the Black radical tradition like W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and James Baldwin. The series is dedicated to the 150th birth anniversary of VI Lenin and is going to take place every Sunday in April from 2 to 4 p.m. The structure of today, like our previous discussions, will be about 35 to 40 minutes of a presentation by Dr. Monteiro, and please feel free to post your comments during his presentation, and it will be followed by the question and answer session where we'll share your comments with him and get his responses. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Monteiro.
Yeah, thanks a lot, man. Yeah, I'd like to say Ramadan Mubarak to all the Muslims. I'd like to say happy birthday to W.E.B Du Bois. It was his birthday on Friday. And happy 150th birthday to VI Lenin, whose birthday was last Wednesday on April 22nd. One of the things we said last time is that we are on the cusp of a change of epochs, I think, from the age of Europe to the age of humanity. And we agree with W.E.B. Du Bois that the future world will be what, hold it.
I just hit the record button.
That's okay, man.
Sorry.
Will be what Black men and dark men and women make it. So we're, going gradually through the epoch, at least the philosophies of modern Europe, which is the epoch of Europe and of capitalism itself, in order to think about the future beyond capitalism and beyond European hegemony. Well, today we just want to do something with Hegel and Marx and Lenin. I think we brought this up last week that Hegel bitterly opposed Immanuel Kant, especially as it related to what human beings can know. You might recall that Immanuel Kant, that name is spelled K-A-N-T, said that what we can know is not the essence of things, or what he called the things in themselves, but we can only know that which is given to us, the things for us. And that pretty much consisted of what we can know through our senses and how we can explain those sense experiences through certain categories of knowledge, especially the categories of time and space. Hegel, Kant's fellow German, a generation younger, bitterly opposed Kant. He said that Kant had limited the possibilities of scientific knowledge, that to understand the world, we had to understand it as it is in motion. To understand phenomenon, we had to understand them as they are in motion. And ultimately, we can know things in themselves or the essences of things because they will reveal themselves over time. What is the foundation of of motion, Hegel said it is a dialectic consisting of the unity of opposites. If you want to know a thing, you have to know it in motion, which is to say you have to know it as a unity of opposites. And as such, it is not a static world or a static relationship of human beings to the world, but it is a dynamic one. This kind of unity of opposites, Hegel called contradictions. Now, most of philosophy, at least Western philosophy from Aristotle forward, looked at things, and especially logic, from the standpoint of non-contradiction. A thing was itself, that is A would equal A. A thing was not itself, that is A is not B. And the final law of Aristotle's logic is what we call the law of the excluded middle. A thing cannot be itself and its opposite at the same time. Hegel said the opposite, that all things exist as themselves and their opposites. And to know them and to know their essence, you have to know them as that. So it was not just enough to talk about a thing's being, you had to talk about its becoming. What Hegel has introduced into the philosophy of knowing and into logic was history and time, etc. I'd just like to say a couple of things about more that maybe I didn't mention last time, and that is what Hegel called the law of the negation of the negation. That is to say that logic proceeds not in identities, but in negation. For example, Marx would take that law and say, for example, that socialism was the negation of the negation. The earlier negation would be capitalism, which itself negated feudalism. And so socialism is the negation of a negation. Marx would further go into it and say that all history is the history of a class conflict. He would therefore take Hegel's logic and apply it to the history of society, the history of man and woman, as it were. Class conflict in the Marxist notion is a conflict of opposites. An owning class, which we would today call the modern capitalist class, and a class that has to work to survive. We would call that a proletariat. It is that unity of opposites which explains capitalism. And in a large measure, up till this day, it explains the essence of capitalism in a Marxist framework. Now, when we get to next week, we'll talk about Du Bois and what happens to that binary in the face of the color line and the division of humanity and the division of the working classes around the world that is rooted in the existence of the color line. Nonetheless, Marx would take what Hegel had produced and apply it to history. Now, Hegel argued that the ultimate would be man's ultimate or absolute awareness of himself and of the world, what we could call things in their totalities. That this could only happen, he felt, when the spiritual conditions were ripe for it. And that, he said, would probably come with the emergence of a Prussian state based upon his philosophy. Marx said this was a form of idealism. It was not grounded in material reality or objective history. Marx would say, well, we'd have to flip Hegel on his head and take his dialectic, his unity of opposites, his negation of negation, and apply it to material reality. Marx would call this scientific socialism. In its application to history, he would call it historical materialism and define Hegel's approach as historical idealism. Hegel was an idealist, according to Marx, because he believed that ideas could transform reality, material reality, that is. Marx would argue that this transformation of material relations in society would transform ideology. Just a couple of other things. Kant, and one of the bitter arguments that Hegel had with Kant is that Kant believed that everything significant was the property of the individual. It's what we call subjectivism. That since we will never be able to know the world outside of our senses, it is not worth even talking about it or referencing it. We call Kant a subjectivist, a subjective idealist. He is a phenomenologist in the sense that his philosophy is a study of phenomena that is confined to the individual, to our senses, to what comes to us and we experience in our senses. This idealism or subjective idealism, this Kantianism, has reappeared in different forms from the 1700s when Kant wrote his critiques up until today. I would insist that postmodernism itself is not only a form of subjective idealism, but a form of neo-Kantianism. There are different philosophies of science that are refashionings of Kant's subjective idealism. While Kant denied the existence of a world outside of our senses, at least a world outside of our senses that we could know, hence the world, if it existed outside of our senses, was meaningless to us. Hegel said the opposite, that the world is not a totally subjective invention, but there is a dialectic between the objective world, the world outside of our senses, outside of our consciousness, and the subject himself or herself. When we talk of the subject of knowing, we're talking about the individual. When we talk about the object of knowledge, we're talking about all of that beyond the individual. Which sets up a very interesting thing, because much of what Hegel talked about, an objective world, a world that the subjects of history, the subjects of knowledge, the agents of knowledge that we seek and fight to know, struggle to know, much of that in our time has been discarded. It is irrelevant. It is insignificant. A lot of times we call that today intersectionality. Sometimes we call it identity politics. It is associated with contemporary or modern philosophers like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and a whole school of literary and cultural studies that only concerns itself with the individual. Whereas Hegel would say, as Marx would say, there is a truth beyond us. The Kantians and neo-Kantians would argue that the only truths that we can be really certain about are those that we invent. The world is an invention of the individual and of the subject. I think I already mentioned that Marx said all history is the history of the class struggle. History is an ongoing dialectic between oppressor and oppressed, the struggle for freedom and the struggle to maintain oppression. In a deeper sense, Marx would say in the modern era, it is the struggle between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. Now, for Marxism, Hegel is the most important philosopher. And Marx and his closest collaborators and closest collaborator, Friedrich Engels, wrote a number of critiques of Hegel, explanations of Hegel, and the application of Hegel to various sciences. For instance, Marx wrote a book called The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. His friend Friedrich Engels wrote a book called Dialectics of Nature. And they were saying that Hegel was the beginning, and Hegel had to be reshaped and reconfigured to make his dialectic really applicable to science and to the objective material world. Now, Hegel claimed, and he makes this claim very, very strongly, that philosophy is the science of sciences, that all of the other sciences, be they biology, physics, chemistry, mathematics, were, how could you put it, below the theoretical, philosophical level of philosophy. And all of those sciences needed philosophy in order to understand themselves. In other words, philosophy, and in particular logic, were important to explain the laws of the development, let us say, of physics, the laws of the development of chemistry, of biology, and, for example, of the calculus and geometries. That without philosophy and logic, experimentation and the collection of data and all of that stuff that science does would be blind and without a direction. With logic, its inherent laws of the various sciences would be explained. So in that sense, Hegel is connecting philosophy and in particular logic to science and scientific knowledge itself. Well, of course, today, I don't know that there are many philosophers who even reference, many scientists who even reference philosophy or logic. We think that science is more aptly connected to technology and the invention of devices, etc. What Hegel again thought, that every science ultimately is the study of the laws of development of the various fields of knowledge that they're involved with. I think I mentioned this last time, that Einstein's theory of relativity is has been studied from the standpoint of its explanation, or revealing, I should say, of the laws of development of the relationship, the dialectical relationship between energy and mass, and on and on and on. How, for example, dialectical logic would be applied to quantum mechanics, I don't know, but from a philosophical standpoint, from a Hegelian standpoint, it would be the function of philosophy to explain that. But again, you know, Marx has felt that Hegel had not gone far enough. Probably, and then of course we talked the last time about how Marx applied dialectical logic to the to political economy, and in a certain sense, that's why Marx, as a political economist, is different from earlier political economists, for example, Adam Smith or David Ricardo. But what Marx did in the first chapter, and this is kind of a discovery of Lenin's, is to lay out a logic, his own logic, his materialist logic. And if you read that first chapter, Das Kapital, you know, he has dialectically opposite concepts like value and exchange value, labor and capital. What are some of the other categories that he had? He would look at the difference between production and distribution. And it's all dialectical. He's trying to take, frankly, you know, many of the categories and concepts that Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations had presented, but according to Marx, had not been adequately explained. They were, how could you say, separate categories of explanation. But for Marx to fully understand value, you had to understand them in their dialectical character, i.e. value as value and value as exchange value. As value, it is the creation of labor power. As exchange value, it is that created value in exchange, in circulation, and on and on and on. He would later in other volumes of his Das Kapital study money, the process of circulation, and so on. But what he comes to in the end, and in this large sense, is that the capitalist system, because it exists in and through contradiction, had the seeds of its own destruction. That the system of exploitation, of class exploitation and class conflict were the seeds of the destruction of capitalism. And that objectively and scientifically, the laws of the development of capitalism ultimately lead to its stagnation and decline. A lot of people look at what's happening now and say that's where we're at in the development of capitalism. Just another thing, this idea of laws of development, that's in Hegel and it's in Marx. Laws of the development of phenomenon, laws of the development of social systems, laws of the development of biological or living matter. This concept of development, another way to talk about that is laws of becoming. All things exist in the process of becoming. From a social scientific point of view, the issue is if we are to understand and know the society that we live in, we have to understand it in its processes of becoming, i.e. the laws of development of that system. Um, I know that, Marx and Engels, when they wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, it was an application of dialectics to history. And so Marx and Engels differed with a lot of other revolutionaries of their time who were considered more anarchistic. In other words, there were no laws, objective laws of society. Individuals make revolutions when they feel it's the time to do so, irrespective of the stage of development of the social system they're seeking to transform. Well, we see a lot of that today, by the way. We call it subjectivism. It is often associated with what we call philosophical or political anarchism. The will of the individual supersedes the laws of the development of a social system. And I think we talked about this yesterday in the Free School live stream, the question of the youth who badly want to change society, but think it is done based upon their will rather than, well, first of all, rather than any larger collective like a class, but that they can do whatever they want. We see it in movements like Black Lives Matter, certain movements around gender, and a practice that disparages the working masses. And in a society like ours, disparages, belittles, ignores the Black proletariat. We will return to that with Du Bois. But probably the most sophisticated and mature application of Hegel to the revolutionary movement was Lenin. One of the big, really huge problems of Western academic and non-academic philosophy is their ignoring of Lenin as a philosopher and as a contributor to the history of philosophy. Basically, I think the two most important works by Lenin in philosophy is his conspectus on Hegel's Science of Logic, and another book that he wrote called Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, which is a rejoinder to a kind of a Kantian by the name of Ernest Mach. And he defends a dialectical and materialist approach to natural science phenomena. But I'd like to just say a little bit about his conspectus, Lenin's conspectus of Hegel's Science of Logic. Like I said last week, for revolutionaries, Hegel's most important work is the Science of Logic. It is important because of some of the things I've already said. One, for any oppressed group of people, a philosophy that is rooted in history and sees all things as transient and in the process of change, that philosophy is always appealing to the oppressed. The idea of constant development and change is less appealing to ruling classes. For example, in the United States, the prevailing idea, at least coming out of the ruling class, is that this nation was formed based upon the genius of the founders and the divine will of God, that this country was more or less perfect at its founding, in spite of slavery and genocide, and that the legal, political insights of the founders have been critical, decisive in creating this special nation. Certainly if you're a slave in the 18th and 19th century, that means you would be locked into slavery and racial oppression. You, your people, your children, and everybody else forever. If you are a member of the working class, or if you are a exploited Black worker or a Black person, period, if you are part of an oppressed and exploited gender or whatever, the idea that this is the perfect society and not to be changed in any fundamental way is not appealing. So if you get Martin Luther King, for example, and many, many others, this idea of a constant movement of history, that history is always in the process of development. Similarly, if you take a person like Gandhi, he goes to the peasantry, he lives with the peasantry, he lives as the peasants live. And what was his message? His message is that what exists did not always exist and will not always exist. That message is always appealing to the oppressed. In the same way, when Lenin applied dialectics to questions of the state, of imperialism, and of the organization of the political agencies, the political arm of working people, he applied them in a way that saw what was as in a process of change. And that's why, for example, in his work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, the central thesis is that capitalism, in its long trajectory, in its long history, and not that long if you think about world human history, but in its history of development, had reached a critical stage. He said that imperialism, which he would also refer as state monopoly capitalism, a stage where finance and banking and stock markets rule. He said that was a stage, the final stage in the development of capitalism. So imperialism was not just another stage, it was the final stage in the development of capitalism. It was a stage where capitalism would be in a permanent and irreversible crisis. That book was written about 105 years ago, and it seems to be more relevant right now than maybe it was then. Stagnation and parasitism and moribundity, moribund meaning close to death, defines the socioeconomic system. He would do the same thing with his analysis of the state. The state, the modern bourgeois or capitalist state, emerges out of a long history of the formation of the rule of states, which for him was the rule of one class over another. And this is very important. He would say that even if a modern bourgeois state took on the form of democracy, its essence, and here we're back to essence, which Hegel upheld, which Kant denied we could ever know. He said the essence of the state in societies where one class oppresses and exploits another is that the state is the arm of the class that oppresses. It is the arm of the ruling class, as it were. And Lenin would argue that there cannot be a revolution, a real revolution, unless the oppressed class can seize state power. Without state power, the new or rising class does not have the power to transform the society and to once and for all eliminate the potential of the exploiting classes to retake power. He would say that a revolutionary state must act decisively to end all vestiges of the old state. We could talk more about that state theory. I mean, it's, that goes way back to even Plato, but this dialectical understanding of the state. And in Lenin's theory of the state and of the remaking of society, the revolutionary remaking of society, is the idea of stages or transitionary processes. Dialectical logic understands that nothing occurs suddenly or all at once, that all things are processes that inherent and in even the new, let us say, revolutionary state, the new revolutionary society, are contradictions. And then finally, his theory of the Revolutionary Party. He would argue that the dialectic between the vanguard of the people and the people is fundamental to understanding revolutionary leadership. In this regard, Lenin is addressing a number of political and ideological trends that existed in Russia from even the 1880s, 1890s going forward. One of them was anarchism, that you can bring down the old state without the people. You can bring down the old society without the people, that a few committed militants willing to take courageous individual action could weaken and ultimately bring the state down, or at least trigger mass uprisings to bring the state down. We're familiar with like classical anarchism, the individual actor, or the small group. We see that in our time. But the less well-known would be, for example, the great German-Polish revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, who believed that leadership would be defined by the willingness to enter the trade unions and call for general strike, dramatic mass action, and that the general strike, when it would happen, could be an effective means of bringing down the old society. That kind of anarchism, we see, elements of it having arisen in the United States in the 1890s and early 20th century. We call Anecho Syndicalism. What does that mean? It is the anarchism of those who think that the unions will be the instrument of bringing down the old society. For Lenin, that was anarchism, in the sense that he believed that the Revolutionary Party must be connected to every aspect of the lives of the working people, that that party must commit itself to the long process of the development, ideologically, especially and organizationally, of the working class. This dialectic between the Revolutionary Party and the masses is a seldom understood part of Lenin. And certainly those who believe that an immediate and quick toppling of the old system is what is desired, rather than the long processes of equipping with the ideas and the politics of working people with the knowledge to ultimately bring that old system down, or to take power, and this I think is quite significant, to take power in that moment when the old ruling class is unable to rule as it has in the past. And for Lenin to guarantee that the oppressed class will no longer accept the old system, it means that a significant part of the oppressed class must be prepared not only to complain about the old system of rule, but to move decisively to change it. Let me kind of end on this. The Russian Revolution, and I guess I'll put it this way, Lenin's great crime was to have been successful in overthrowing the old regime. And the West had proclaimed the Russian Revolution from its very inception to have been a crime. Not only that the Russian Revolution committed crimes, but itself was a crime to be extinguished at any cost. For that reason, in the West, very few people have anything other than a criminalized version of the Russian Revolution and a distortion of Lenin's thinking on philosophy, on political science, on economic theory. But in line with what we're doing, his turn to Hegel is very important. And I think a big part of his genius was the application of dialectics, which is a philosophical framework, to the day-to-day needs and processes of the working people and of revolutionary change. It's another way of saying it is that Lenin becomes one of the first thinkers and philosophers to apply philosophy to freeing an entire class, an entire people from capitalist oppression. And of course, then after the Russian Revolution, we have the rise of existentialism, which returns to subjectivism. Often the existentialist will claim to have been in the revolutionary movement at one point, but became disenchanted by it. And so, or that the working class didn't live up to what the intellectuals thought it should do. And therefore, we have to return to a study of all of the problems of, quote, modern man, which in their sense mainly meant the working class. And so we would see in thinkers like Martin Heidegger, we would see it in a version of Jean-Paul Sartre, this idea that the revolutionary struggle was not possible, that the working class in Europe were more predisposed to fascism than to socialism, and that to understand the working class, you had to understand its socio-psychological pathologies, this kind of psychologizing of class conflict. Another form that it took, and this is Sartre's Being and Nothingness, his first major work published in the 1940s, is the idea that since the subject, the subjective, the individual, is the principal agent of history, outside of objective movements of history, and since European reason and European man has been the central player on the historical stage, fascism and reaction represented the coming to the fore of ethical, psychological problems inherent to modern society. Let me put that another way, that where Lenin said the problem for modern society was class exploitation, existentialists, be they Sartre or Martin Heidegger, said the problem of modern society is, in Sartre's sense, social psychology, which predisposed people to amorality, immorality, which he called bad faith, lying to oneself. Or Heidegger would say that modern man, and I put quotes here, modern man did not know himself because he did not know his origins in earlier societies. This concept of being, which Heidegger takes from Hegel, being is the question. What does it mean to be in society, to be in a nation, and being and time, being in a specific society at a particular time in history. In that sense, the dynamic processes of revolutionary change are replaced with a static, psychological, cultural, temporal explanation a la Martin Heidegger, or an ethical, temporal explanation a la Jean-Paul Sartre, which then meant that the reclaiming of the revolutionary spirit that gave birth to the Russian Revolution would occur in the anti-colonial struggle and its forms of leadership, forms of theorizing, history, etc. I'll stop there, Joe.
All right, so I'd like to again welcome everyone to share their comments, responses, questions, other things in the comments section of the live stream. But I'll start with maybe some questions. Well, first, I think maybe just generally it would be helpful if we discuss some of the historical context. I mean, basically, the period you're discussing is roughly 100 years from
Absolutely.
1840 till the end of World War II in Europe. And we discussed last week about the role of the French Revolution in informing the ideas of thinkers like Kant, Hegel, and you mentioned again today. Could you say a bit about Marx and what were some of the political events he lived through or was engaged with? And then perhaps, I mean, of course, Lenin is engaged with the Russian Revolution. What was his thinking or the impact of the other events in Europe on him as a philosopher or ideologue?
That's very interesting. And as you point out, you know, Kant and Hegel were supporters of the French Revolution. Kant supported the left wing of the French Revolution, the Jacobins and Robespierre. I don't know exactly what wing of it Hegel supported. Hegel was born in 1770. So by the time of the French Revolution, he's in his late 20s, early 30s. But I think the Achilles heel of Hegel was that he abandoned the revolutionary spirit of the French Revolution and went with Napoleon. I think Hegel's philosophy of history was tied up with a great man theory as well, that a great man could alter the spirit of the time. But then again, neither Hegel nor Kant were talking about the type of revolution that Marx and Lenin would ultimately talk about. Now, of course, after the Napoleonic Wars and turmoil in France, and this idea of bringing back a monarch or something that looked like a king, and all of those struggles, in the midst of that, probably inspired by the spirit of the French Revolution, a new form of working class struggle emerged throughout Europe. And 1848 was a high point of that. So Marx and his colleagues and followers saw themselves as reclaiming the spirit of the French Revolution. But in their case, the left wing of the French Revolution, including Robespierre and Babeuf. Now, there was another revolution occurring at the same time of the French Revolution, and that was the Haitian Revolution. And I don't believe that Marx and his followers saw any direct connection between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, or as some would have it, the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution, because Du Bois said that the French Revolution was a byproduct of the resistance of slaves and non-property owners in Haiti. And that the French Revolution created space and opportunity for the Haitians to deepen the resistance, ultimately leading to the Haitian Revolution of 1804. But Marx, when he talks, and Engels, when they talk in the Communist Manifesto about the coming society, and that society that the working class must fight for democracy, must fight for the redistribution of land in a lot of ways, and public education and such things. Well, in a lot of ways, they were taking the program of the left wing of the French Revolution and applying it to the class struggle of working people in Europe. And they would continue that, as would Lenin. The backdrop is the French Revolution always. And I would just say, another thing about that is that I think that Marx and Lenin were ultimately thinkers in the spirit of the Enlightenment, of course, the left wing of the Enlightenment, that they saw the bourgeois revolutions, especially the French Revolution, as only going part of the way, that they said that the socialist revolution would keep its promise about democracy, not only legal or democracy on paper, but substantive democracy, that real democracy could only be achieved if the working people were liberated from capitalist exploitation. So they felt that the French Revolution was important, but only went part of the way, and then itself was undermined by the Napoleonic Wars and then the return of a form of monarchy and successive dictators and claims to the throne, or claims to the spirit of the French Revolution.
Right, and I think also adding a bit onto that is that the significance, as you're saying, of Marx and Lenin for the oppressed in other parts of the world outside Europe is that there were some of the major thinkers who were starting to become critical of European colonialism and policies towards non-European peoples. Perhaps maybe you could say a few words about the relationship of Marx to or his positions on the some of the things that Du Bois read about the U.S. Civil War, the transatlantic slave trade, India, and then of course you mentioned Lenin's imperialism and the relationship that he would have to the anti-colonial struggle. I mean, there's an interesting dynamic about that they're coming out of the European Enlightenment. As you said, they represent the left wing of the European Enlightenment. But there's a degree of, or a large degree of a criticism of the project that's emerged out of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, keep on talking, man.
Sure. I mean, I just, I mean, I think that's part of the reason those two thinkers are important for a lot of the things we've been discussing at the Free School and generally, as you were saying, for thinkers outside of Europe, whether it's Gandhi, Du Bois, or the various communist movements that were formed in the world.
Keep on going. I don't mean to cut you off, man.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically. I just wanted to raise that.
And this is very important because as I was trying to say, Europe became embroiled in a philosophical and ideological struggle about how to move forward. And see, Lenin had this saying, I mean, if you're unprepared at a certain point, if the movement is unprepared to move towards socialism, it cannot fulfill the democratic aspirations of the people. In other words, the final guarantor of democracy is socialism. That capitalism, and especially in its period of crisis, cannot guarantee democracy. In fact, it is more predisposed to become authoritarian and anti-democratic. I mean, we see that today. Cuba is one of the most democratic places on the globe. And by democracy, we're meaning the rule of the people, whatever form it takes. So the reason I mention after World War II, the shifting of the revolutionary spirit of the epoch towards Asia and Africa and South America, this is huge because then, in many instances, the communists and Marxist-Leninists must catch up. For example, the Indian independence movement, which did not take a path as one might predict if you attempt to organize it on the basis of the Russian Revolution. Now, of course, Lenin writes about the peasant question. He writes about the national question and the colonial question. Much of this would be fleshed out by the Communist International after 1921-22 and going forward, where they were saying things like, well, after the Russian Revolution, the most important center of world revolution is the colonial world. Lenin would even talk about looking to the east, to India and China, and a potential alliance between Soviet Russia, India, and China, which at that time may have constituted, if not the majority of the world, something approaching 50%. But the demographic weight of that would be enormous in changing the trajectory of history. But then, no one, it would have, pardon me, I don't say no one, it would have been difficult to predict the rise of Gandhi, and the form of his leadership, which was unique. just in the same way, it would have been very difficult to predict the rise of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, especially when one considers the religious form, the ethical, moral form of both Gandhian leadership and King's leadership, and what precisely that meant in terms of the rise in the United States of the Black proletariat. Was King's religious philosophy an obstacle to class consciousness? Or in India, was Gandhi's Hinduism an obstacle to class consciousness? Or was religion the opiate of the people in the colonial and nationally oppressed world as it was in Europe? Or was there greater democracy and possibility of connectivity between leadership of mass movements and religious institutions than was the case, let us say, in a Europe dominated by the Catholic Church, which was in many instances the state and the ideological cover for the system of exploitation? So what from 19th and 20th century Marxism and Leninism could be applied and how it would be applied became the test of communist parties, especially in the era when Europe, it seemed, had exhausted its revolutionary potentiality, you know, and that still remains a big question, as you know. I'll stop there. I don't want to talk too much, Joe.
Okay, so we have some questions from our viewers. The first question is from Ryan Rebel. He says, how are we to slowly and deliberately equip the working class with the knowledge requisite for revolution when many oppressed people share a healthy mistrust of grand social theories, and when knowledge and education are so repressed by the ruling class, both through ideological warfare and the choking of resources for education?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think as Ryan would agree, the question of the political and ideological education of the masses is always decisive. I think for us in the United States, the great example that we must learn from and not try to imitate is the great civil rights movement. And, the thing that I've grown to be impressed with about Gandhi and King, about the Gandhian movement, and the King-led civil rights movement, is that the leadership went to the people, lived with the people, provided examples for the people, and in so doing, were trusted tremendously by the people. I think one of the key things for revolutionaries of our time, especially in the United States, to understand that before you can, quote, educate the people must trust you. And all kinds of performances and so on, much of the time for the media, does not garner trust. The people are able to tell fakery and performance from genuine concern. The other thing is, and I know this is the case for Black folk, we have our institutions, we have our churches, we have our colleges and universities, we have our civic organizations, we have our political movements and so on. And these are of long standing. And I know that one cannot unite with the people while disrespecting their institutions. So how do revolutionaries establish and sustain organic relationships with the people? Is a big question. And that's something that must be learned. You're not born knowing how to do that. Philadelphia is very different from Detroit, Michigan. I haven't been in Detroit in a long time, but I don't think the way they do things is exactly the same way we do things here. Here we have neighborhoods and closely knit communities. And then we have churches. So it is not so much the Leninist theory of revolutionary ideas coming from outside of the working class. I think people have seen changes in their own lives. You know, the life of Muhammad Ali still factors huge in the thinking of Black folk. His resistance to the war in Vietnam, people loved and trusted him because he was prepared to sacrifice for principle. You know, Islam, and you know this, Joe, in the Black community is so different from Islam in many parts of the world. Now, we have some Sunni Muslims that practice a kind of traditional Sunni Islam. But if you look at Black folk, we're more like Sufiist. And there's an overlap of Christianity and Islam, the Bible and the Quran, but all directed to uplifting a people who are constantly put down and vilified. So we have to factor all that in. I think, you know, that's why, forgive me if I'm talking too long, Ryan, but that is why unless you can factor in King and Du Bois and Baldwin, you can't get it right in this society. And then factor it in such a way that unites all democratic forces with that force that has always led in opposition to oppression, and that's the Black proletariat. That's the challenge, I would say.
Great. We have a related question from Jacob Harris. He says, in terms of the Revolutionary Party, does the Revolutionary Party assert higher morality and influence the people? Guess I'm confused because there is a need to be deeply connected to the people, but how is the Revolutionary Party supposed to interact with the ideas of the people, whether they be ideologically clear or not?
Yeah, great question, Jay. You know, and this is, you know, what is a party, first of all? You know, a party can take the form of a democratic centralist party. A party could be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It doesn't call itself a party. A party could be the Civil Rights Movement, which is a united front of activists and movements from different parts of the country, different parts of the South. At this point, I think, Jake, and you can respond, I think that something different than the traditional Bolshevik or Leninist form of party organization and party interaction with the masses will be called for. It's no less disciplined. It's no, you know, the other thing is people are far more educated than they were in the time of the Russian Revolution. You only had a very small part of the population who were educated or intellectuals, and even a smaller part of them who were revolutionary intellectuals. I think today, people are far better educated. People know what they want. Oftentimes, we just don't know how to get there yet. So I favor a movement of the type led by King. And I didn't think that movement was any less sophisticated and ideologically developed than the Communist Party. I was a member of the Communist Party. You know, it was great back then. But, and you know, I'm especially, as you know, I'm especially indebted to Henry Winston, his notion of realignment, political realignment based upon united front, that the people, and especially Black folk, and I say more so now than ever, have a consciousness and a political education where they know what they want in a lot of ways, and everybody doesn't want the same thing, and are seeking ways to unite themselves in such a way as to achieve that. And of course, the great problem, Jake, for our people are the machinations of bourgeois politics and the machinations and distortions of the media, which makes our job a bit more difficult, but we always have to get as close to people and stay close to people as much as we can, not allowing ourselves to be taken off in reckless directions or in directions that submit to the ruling class. That's the way I would look at it, Jay.
All right, great. Ryan Rebel wanted to say thank you so much for your insights. We have another question, I guess moving ahead to the existentialists from Raju. He says, what did the political relationships of Heidegger with Nazism and Sartre with communism and the Algerian struggle for independence relate to their philosophical subjectivism, if any?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that was it. Was that clear, or you want me to
I think so. I mean, and Raju, he could, you know.
Basically, I think he's basically asking, I mean, how did the political relationship of Heidegger with Nazism and Sartre with communism and the Algerian struggle for independence relate to their philosophical subjectivism?
Yeah, this is very important, you know, because here you have Sartre, who's a part of the French resistance to Nazism, and here you have Heidegger, who was a part of the Nazi regime, at least in the university and professorial thing. But then Sartre was a student of Heidegger's, I think in the 1920s. And Sartre, in his Being and Nothingness, acknowledges a debt to Heidegger. And this idea, I use the word being, but you know, Heidegger has this duality, being and existence. Being was the general category, existence was the day-to-day reality, and existence forced the human to decide, and in so choosing in the moral day-to-day world, she or he makes himself. Now, Sartre would take that, and forgive me if I'm making some mistakes on this. A lot of times it's a little complicated and I've forgotten a lot of it. But Sartre takes that, that idea of the individual agency, the existence, to the question, and he's writing during the time of the Nazi occupation of France. So for him, the overriding question is, what is to be done? But in his case, the individual. He said the individual could act in good faith, which is with moral integrity, or he or she could act in bad faith, which meant to abandon any principled moral stance. And by bad faith, he meant collaborating with the Nazis, because there were a lot of collaborators. Good faith is resistance to Nazism. On the other side, Heidegger rolls with the Nazis. He supports the Nazis under the guise of a, how could you say, primordial or foundational Germanic existence, which he saw as going back to the earliest tribal life of Germanic peoples or German-speaking peoples. Heidegger's, and here's where ideology intersects with philosophy. Heidegger's philosophy was shaped by an ideology of German nationalism, with or without Hitler. Sartre's ideology was the opposite. Now, and Raju is absolutely right. They were both subjective idealists. The world was all about what the individual did. Existence placed upon us great challenges of being. And, you know, yeah, I would say that. Now, see, and then there was communism, of course. And the communists and Sartre were predisposed to unity, because ideologically, they were both about the struggle for freedom, and really, freedom in their terms meant at that time the preservation of bourgeois democracy against fascism and authoritarianism. I think that's the best that I could explain it right now, but I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I think I wanted to follow up a little bit on it, talk about this, the existentialists a bit more.
Yes.
You'd mentioned how, you know, Lenin has a very important, perhaps we could say almost close to singular impact on Western political thinking, in the sense that a lot of it is meant to obscure his ideas, or, you know, refute his ideas or ignore his ideas. So would you say that the existentialist movement, in a lot of ways, a reaction to the Russian Revolution and to Lenin? And I mean, would you also include the postmodern turn and all of that as a reaction?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, you know, Sartre, and I think he was serious when he made these statements, because, you know, by the 1960s, he's more radical, and he's writing a book. I think it's a great book, A Critique of Dialectical Reasoning. At that time, he's in the French Communist Party. And by that time, he has already been through the solidarity movement with the Algerian Revolution. So he goes from what he said that Being in Nothingness, his first great book, was written from the standpoint of the petty bourgeoisie. And probably he was right. I think I would have to agree with him. But he, and that's an important book in other ways, I have to say, but I think he discovers that the path of existentialism, the focus upon the individual, the subject as the individual, could only resolve certain problems as they confronted the individual. But what about society as a whole? What about the anti-colonial struggle? So his experience in the anti-colonial struggle, his discourses with Black writers and thinkers like Frantz Fanon, his becoming acquainted with the centrality of the color line. And I think his critique of dialectical reason is the only great philosophical work in the Western, really 20th century tradition that has a full exploration of racism as a philosophical question from the European standpoint. You know what I'm saying? So one has to, I think, look at Sartre as a radical, constantly in movement and in motion and shaped by world events, and in particular by the anti-colonial struggle, by the way, the struggle of the Vietnamese against French colonialism and the struggle of the Algerians against French colonialism. And indeed, it seems to me, and forgive me if I'm too blunt in saying this, I think the nihilism, the pessimism, the recklessness, and frankly, the garbage of the European 20th century petty bourgeois thinker is brought to the fore in contemporary postmodernism. It is completely irresponsible. It is completely without a, how could you say, a force to keep it responsible to something besides itself. You know, one of the things that's very frustrating is that it would have been difficult for a postmodern movement like we see today to get the type of traction that it has had there been a civil rights movement and a leadership that focuses upon mass resistance and freedom. And so, yeah, I would say, you know, and of course, you know, we didn't mention, and we haven't talked about it much, of Friedrich Nietzsche, Man and Superman. There is no moral foundation for anything. God is dead, which is another way of saying purpose in history. An imagination of a greater possibility. There is no arc of the moral universe. There is no truth, you know. And so where does it leave humanity? Where does it leave humanity? Because none of these things are possible, change in a significant way. Democracy for the people can't even be thought of. And that's ugly in my opinion.
We have a comment from Colin Clement. She says, could you elaborate on how existentialism is a reaction to the Russian Revolution? In my limited education, it was understood only as a reaction to the horrors of World War I.
I don't think so. Although I would partially agree, and that was Germany in the 1920s, the Weimar Republic, the rise of the Frankfurt School, and other competing philosophical schools. See, indeed, the existentialist movement, the surrealist movement, such movements as these saw World War I and the Russian Revolution as part of the same crisis. That had there not been the barbarism of the World War I, there would not have been the Russian Revolution. So they both represented forms of anti-freedom and crisis of Western civilization. That's why Heidegger is so committed to getting back to something more fundamental and to shape or define German existence. And this is where he messes up, and this is where the law of Nazism for him, because the Nazis were talking about the will of the German will, and the pre-technological society, and the alienation of German from German, that kind of stuff. And then a kind of drawing on Nietzsche, man and Superman, overman, man whose will, the individual whose will can override the decadence of modernity and produce the conditions for a superior morality. I think indeed the Russian Revolution and World War I was seen as a part of the same thing, the same crisis, and existentialism and surrealism and all these forms of psychologism in the Frankfurt School, the return to Freud, and that's, you know, this Freudian Marxist theoretical alignment, Herbert Marcuse, for example, the turn to a, quote, critique of culture. You know, all of these things are ways to try to explain the collapse of Europe. And, you know, just like you said, Joe, that's what we see now. How to explain that Europe is falling behind Asia. And if Europe is falling behind Asia, how long will it be before Africa and Asia realign in a re-civilizing of humanity? So yeah, man, that's the way I would put it.
All right, we have another question from Vincent Kelly. He says, thank you for this lecture, Doc. I'm curious what you think of the impacts of the French Revolution from a civilizational and religious perspective. This quote from conservative thinker Edmund Burke, directed at the French revolutionaries, come to mind. The quote, you began ill because you began by despising everything that belonged to you, end quote. Do you think in some ways Europeans had to give up certain grounding and potentially even progressive aspects of their civilizational heritage in the French Revolution and its aftermath, which has led to the white left's intractable hostility toward organizing through religion, the church, and other institutions seen as traditional or even feudal? Whereas perhaps for Black Americans and many in the anti-colonial struggle, religion and related institutions were not already by implication counter-revolutionary.
Yeah, and that's why, yeah, thank you for that question. Wow. Some of these questions are beyond my reach, I have to say, so I'll be improvisational. Indeed, the French Revolution was not just one event or one tendency. There was, I should say, a communist tendency in the French Revolution. That was the famous Babu, who was executed. But, and then there was the more, I guess, pragmatic or reasonable left in the Jacobins. And then there was the conservative trend who always wanted to bring the monarchy back. And eventually, after the Napoleonic Wars and the period of chaos, I think in the 1820s, 18 teens, they did bring the monarchy back in a kind of British parliament and royalist thing. But see, the question of religion ultimately is a question of ideology, especially when it is institutionalized as the state. So religion was not just religion, it was the ideology of the state. And to overthrow the state, one had to overthrow the religion of the state. There were other religious people, like we mentioned, I think last time, Thomas Munzer. He was a priest. But his religion was more like Howard Thurman's, the Jesus of the oppressed. What does the religion of the oppressed look like as against the religion of the oppressor? So religion is not the problem. Religious ethics are not the problem. Even religious metaphysics. But it is, when we speak of religion, we have to show that ideological division. It is the religion and metaphysics and ethics of the oppressor framed as religion that is the problem. And I think we have to always make that clear. Even within the African American religious tradition, church tradition, there are radical trends, really radical trends in the abolitionist movement. Such people as John Brown, you know, the foundation of his thinking was the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, you know what I'm saying? The great white abolitionist Theodore Parker, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends to justice. All of which had a tremendous impact upon Frederick Douglass and other Black abolitionists. And of course, I mean, how do you explain a Martin Luther King? Who was talking about a new synthesis of all religions, his pilgrimage to nonviolence, you know, the pilgrimage to Hinduism, that Howard Thurman and his wife Sue Bailey going to India. That's such a beautiful, not just gesture, but the substance of it, because they saw in Gandhi the religion of the oppressed, you know? I think, but then, you know, within the Black church, you got some real conservatives, you know, who want to make the question of religion all about religion, you know, which is all about the afterlife or all about living as good as you can under existing circumstances. Those type of people bitterly oppose Martin Luther King. And that's why, if you know, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference formed out of the National Baptist Convention, because there was not enough space in the National Baptist Convention, the largest church organization among Black people, for Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and Shuttlesworth and those Black preachers who wanted to overturn the racial system in the South. So that's what I would say. Religion is more about ideology, connection to the masses, connection to struggle.
I think bringing it a little bit back to Europe and particularly to Heidegger, can you, maybe shed some light on this whole phenomenon of fascism that emerges in this time? Again, something very relevant to today. European fascism in the 1920s and 30s, Italy and Germany, and its philosophical roots and its philosophical concepts. And also, it seems, based on what you were saying, and related to Vincent's question as well, that people like Heidegger and even some of the folks in the Nazi Party seemed like they were trying to go to a pre-modern Europe, where they had a deep critique of the European Enlightenment.
Yes,
but it led to, a sort of different conclusions than others, than, for example, the anti-colonial struggle. And I think even Du Bois in Color and Democracy talks about how there may have been a democratic impulse in some ways at the heart of, German fascism, for example. But anyway, maybe you can discuss fascism. That's something I think everyone is interested in.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Ideologically, Heidegger was a counter-revolutionary. I don't think there's not a question in my mind that the philosophy that he developed was a philosophy designed to support an anti-communist, counter-revolutionary ideology. And that's why he returns to existence and pre-modern existence. I think he recognized, as we have been discussing, that the Russian Revolution constituted, as the Russian revolutionaries said it, the fulfillment of the radical wing of the French Revolution. That upon the shoulders of the Russian proletariat and peasantry would come a new democracy, a democracy in substance, that they would do away with the exploiting classes. And that was unacceptable to people like Heidegger. Of course, ideologically, Sartre is different. It's so interesting, Sartre's anti-imperialism would get him in trouble with a good part of the French existentialist movement, in particular Camus, who was his friend at one point, but they broke the friendship over the question of the Algerian independence. Albert Camus, the writer and philosopher, believed that the Algerians should not be independent, but should be assimilated into the French Commonwealth or some sort of arrangement like that. So the ideological questions have to be uppermost. And the ideological questions are like Paul Robeson defined them. What side are you on? He was talking about the artist. The artist has to take a stance, either for freedom or against it. That goes for the philosopher, and what Heidegger did is to take a stance for oppression and literally murder and genocide. And because the real genocide, the deepest genocide, took place in the Soviet Union. And that was the target, to overturn socialism. And it's seldom spoken about, but indeed that's where Heidegger was coming from. And the other side of it, by the way, the idea that socialism appealed to the more backward peoples of the world, and the Slavs and the Russians were considered very backward. And of course, that's why Hitler called his party the National Socialist Workers' Party. And they just abbreviated it to Nazism, because they tried to appropriate both socialism and the workers' movement to a right-wing movement, Nazi movement, a counter-revolutionary, anti-working class movement under the guise of nationalism.
So expanding on that a bit, maybe this might also be a good opportunity to discuss some of the, particularly the German theologians in this period who would have an impact on the thinking of Martin Luther King. Oh, yeah. I'm particularly thinking of Paul Tillich, I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer, oh, yeah. Perhaps there are others. And I was thinking after our last lecture, the significance of Martin Luther King. His name was Martin Luther King, and apparently maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think his father changed his name from Michael King to Martin Luther King. So maybe you can discuss the significance of that as
well. Well, the first part of it, Martin Luther King famously used this phrase, the fierce urgency of now. And I think that comes directly from his encounters with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the anti-Nazi Church of Germany, which was underground, and Paul Tillich. One of the theologians that King writes about in his PhD dissertation is Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich was not only a Christian, and probably not so Christian, but he was also a socialist. We could call him a Christian socialist. Of course, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a thoroughly anti-Nazi, anti-Hitler theologian who was committed to nonviolence. And so that existential choice is, what does the person committed to nonviolence due in the face of a great existential danger to world humanity. And he and his colleagues decided that to save humanity, we would take action that is not necessarily in keeping with our day-to-day moral choice, but a larger moral value, and we would try to assassinate Hitler. Well, they weren't too expert at it and they failed, and Bonhoeffer was arrested and tried and sentenced to death. And about a week or so before Germany was freed by the Soviet army, he was executed. I think he was only in his 30s. Indeed, it is true that Martin Luther King's father, in about 1930 or so, maybe a little earlier, went on a pilgrimage, I guess, with a group of religious people to Germany. And he went to some site, maybe the home of Martin Luther. And it was at that time, and I don't know all the conditions, what he was going through, but he decided that he would change his name from Michael King to Martin Luther King, and that his son, his namesake, Michael King Jr., his name would be changed to Martin Luther King Jr. This, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, this is a quite huge thing, because that takes us back to our first lecture and Martin Luther in 1517 and the posting of these 95 theses on the door of the church. And among them is this anti-church, anti-Catholic church thing that only a priest could connect the individual to God. And Martin Luther said no. And that's, I guess, King's name kind of determined or predicted the outcome of his life.
Right. I think that your answer also in some ways gets to Vincent's earlier comment about the role of religion, because you were mentioning, we discussed Father Munzer and some others, but as you were discussing with Tillich and Bonhoeffer, we see into the 20th century these sort of dissident trends within European Christianity, many of whom would look towards outside the West to the Eastern world, many of whom would be interested in the spiritual ideas coming out of the colonial world and from the colonial movement as well. And
it's so interesting that Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam see Islam in their reform definition of it as a force for freedom and liberation. And I think it's very fascinating to me.
Right. I mean, of course, as you were discussing, Martin Luther King is one example of someone in the context of African-American thinkers, whether religious or secular, who are very interested in the ideas, the traditions of the Eastern world and synthesizing them. But I also wanted to ask you about going back to this discussion we were having about Lenin's idea of the vanguard party, some of the questions that were asked about that. And you were talking about, perhaps a vanguard doesn't necessarily have to look like a Leninist party. And I think, because part of what we've been doing in these lectures is talking about the philosophers and their engagements with movements and the histories they were in, maybe you can talk a little bit, well, you did talk a bit about how Lenin formed his theory of the party, but I just was thinking about how it's important to emphasize that he was doing it in a very specific period.
Yeah.
He was totally rethinking concepts in Marxism when he was thinking about organization. And you mentioned figures who don't fit that mold, like King or Gandhi, and you were discussing how in our time, we also need to we need to take into account all the history that's come before, but we need to think of new methods, new forms that fit the, conditions and the people that we're working among. So I don't know if you wanted to shed some more light on the relationship between philosophers or intellectuals and movements, the people, and politics.
And the United States might be among the more complicated projects of radical transformation. And so I think part of what we have to do is study most or many of the forms of resistance and freedom struggles. I know we used to think at times that and this is very interesting because, a lot of times, laws of social development can be a way to hide dogmatism and rigidity. Just because the path of revolutionary change came one way in one society doesn't mean it will be repeated over and over again. I think the Indian independence movement was one of the most complicated political, ideological projects that one can imagine. And it's still going on, or should be going on. I think the struggle in this country, the Black freedom movement, is very complicated because of the conditions under which it occurs. That is the color line and the divisions brought on by it. And then, of course, in our day in particular, this vast power to control the flow and movement of ideas in a very literate population. So I think, for me, it is the extent to which revolutionaries are committed to doing the hard and day-to-day work over a lifetime and more of raising up the type of ideas, the type of unity, the type of resistance that at the right time, a lot of people say we're close to the right time, maybe we are. The people, in the name of democracy and the people, can take power. And that's the ultimate test. As we talk, I think we talked about this yesterday last Sunday. There is no one in this time who would not prefer the most peaceful and nonviolent path to social change. I know that's what I want. But how do we fight for that? On what level of consciousness must the masses be? We've seen in this current COVID-19 crisis, at least according to a lot of press reports, white people have run to the gun stores to get ammunition. Why should that be the first response? There's something pathological about that. But then is there among the majority, the white majority, a tradition, consistent tradition of nonviolence, of a Christian ethic and morality of love? I don't see it. I haven't seen it. Maybe it is there and it has to be activated. I hope that's so. But especially at this stage, I think a lot of people use this idea that we're forming a Leninist party or we're a party as a way of kind of suggesting that, one, they have most of the answers, and two, this could be a quick and fast thing. I think all of those people who are calling for this party and this new party, I think, first of all, they need to have a lot more experience in the modes of revolutionary transformation. And they need to know more about the people themselves, and less sloganeering and less performance and more humble and consistent learning and education.
You were mentioning that people often use this concept of the laws to believe that things will repeat themselves exactly as they did before.
That's a good way to put it, Joe.
And but that's I mean, that's an interesting point, because it speaks to one of the weaknesses in Western philosophy, which goes into political philosophy, and some critics have said that comes from some of the church dogmas that have gone into science about laws that are unchanging. Whereas in a lot of Eastern thought, the ideas of tendencies, even God works in tendencies so that things, can occur differently. Even if they've occurred the same way to a certain extent, it's not, written in stone in that sense. But also we're in where it's 3:51, so in the last 10 minutes. I think unless someone there's another question or a comment from Raju. He says, an idea's revolutionary potential must be connected to the society that it arises in. That an idea can be revolutionary in a particular society and time and lose its revolutionary potential in a different context, or even serve a counter-revolutionary purpose. This is also the problem of applying European thinkers and ideas that emerged in a certain period to other societies, which perhaps we will get to next week.
Yeah, it's so important what Raju was saying. Like he said, that kind of pedagogy or learning, that a commitment to learn is, not too well developed in our revolutionary or our political culture today. And he is right. There's a kind of a dogmatism and stagnation of ideas. Joe, as we have done, it's always, I think we have discovered something in King and Du Bois and Baldwin as iconic thinkers and more. That's an important discovery. And to show the commonality with so many of the Indian anti-colonialists, and then to have discovered, and it seems like we're the only ones to have discovered this, or even to talk about it. What did it signify for so many African Americans to go to India, to learn from the Indian anti-colonial struggle? What did that mean? And then to come back here and be a part of sparking one of the great movements of the 20th century. What did it mean? Now, of course, I was one that went to Russia or the Soviet Union, and I learned a lot there. But through the creativity of the civil rights movement, but a creativity combined with a long-term commitment to suffer for what you believed in. What the Nation of Islam calls staying on post. And I agree with Raju. It's humbling, but it's a beautiful thing, and it gives space for really creativity in all fields of activism, including the moral and ethical, the question of good faith, always acting in good faith and for the highest levels of unity. That's really what I get from King, to tell you the truth. So that's what I would say. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very
yeah.
That's a unique sort of description.
Can I say something, Joe? Then you respond.
Go ahead.
you know, because we think about the Bernie Sanders movement. And at one point they thought it was going to be a quick, fast, and in a hurry thing. We got this, we got the most money, and so on. And suddenly they come up against the Black proletariat, broadly defined. And the whole thing disintegrates. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's worth studying as the opposite of the civil rights movement. You know what I'm saying? Bernie's arrogance, his lack of moral and ideological clarity, his inability to frame political questions as King did in great moral terms. You know what I'm saying? It's like Sartre's urgency of good faith, but taken to a level 10 times higher than Sartre could ever think. And then to have leadership who engendered that in their day-to-day practice. You know, I don't know, have you all seen this documentary called King in the Wilderness?
I haven't seen it yet. I've seen a few clips, but I've heard a lot about it.
You have HBO or access to HBO?
I'm sure I can get a free trial or something. I mean, that's something you recommend. Somebody was commenting earlier for a reading list, but maybe you can give a movie watch list.
Yeah, I think we'll do that maybe for the end. But I would highly recommend. Can I just tell you two small parts of it? You know, it opens up with King having to go to Memphis for the second march of the sanitation workers. The first had been disrupted by provocateurs. And so the lady who was his assistant or secretary was going to drive him to the airport. And as he prepared to go out the door, his two little sons came to the door and said, "Daddy, Daddy, please don't leave us." You know what I'm saying? He says, "No, I'll be back. I just have to go and help people who are suffering." And they said, "No, Daddy, please don't leave us." It's almost as though they were anticipating the worst. And so he went finding to get in the car, and the two little boys jumped on the hood of the car and said, "Daddy, Daddy, please don't leave us." It was so moving that he knew, like they, that his life was, that this would be the final test. And then there's another part where Harry Belafonte, you know, the great actor and activist, who loved Martin Luther King, even to this day, and you can tell it by his, you know, way he talks. And, you know, King had begun to have a twitch, an uncontrollable twitch. And and so it had suddenly gone away. And Belafonte said, "Well, Martin, you know, you don't have the twitch anymore. What happened?" Well, he said, "It went away." He said, "Well, what caused it to go away?" And King said, "I had come to terms with my own death." And then, you know, after the Voting Rights Act is passed, he gives a speech against the war in Vietnam. And it was way beyond anything in its attack upon the US government than anybody expected. And so King says, "This is going to be my life." He said to his staff, Andy Young and Bernard Lafayette and those people, he said to them, "This will be my last campaign, my last great campaign." And he says it's going to be war against war, poverty, and racism. And so the staff is meeting, you know, in Atlanta, the full-time These names might not mean a lot to a lot of people. C.T. Vivian, Bernard Lafayette, Cotton, I forget her first name, and all of them. And according to Andy Young, King cursed them out. He said, "You all don't support me." They said, because they were saying, "Look, Martin, we are tired. We fought all of these battles and we got the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act has been passed, and you need a rest and we need a rest." And King said, "No, there's no time to rest." And Andy said he cussed them out. And he knew that it wouldn't be long, that he had literally gone into the eye of the storm, that he was challenging the American empire at a level that was intolerable to them. And then, of course, when he gave that speech in February of 1968 as a homage to W.E.B. Du Bois, who was then made into a non-person. And when he said that all of his life, Du Bois had been a radical, and at the end of it, he became a communist. And why should we make a big thing of that? And he said, and what he was saying in essence is that it wouldn't make that much of a difference if he were white, because Pablo Neruda, great poet, was also a communist, Shauna Casey, etc. And at that point, he had freed himself from all of the ideological and political constraints of a movement that had to take into account the ideology of the Cold War. But I highly recommend it. I think we will see King in a way he's seldom seen, and especially for the younger generation and the not so young generation. That King is the King that we can turn to, the King that can inspire us and from whom we can learn. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, someone, a Doe, actually shared the link to the documentary in the YouTube, in the comments on YouTube.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so at least it'll be there for a little while. Sometimes they take those off, but
Who's that? Brandon Doe?
No, this Doe from New York.
Hello, Doe from New York. Okay.
If it's all right, we have one more question.
Go ahead, man. Go ahead.
Uh,
You got me started now, man.
From Hazel Scholl Rivera. She says, earlier it was mentioned that being is the ultimate question, and man cannot know himself if he did not know prior to himself. How does the miseducation of the history of oppressed peoples delay or affect the laws of development? Excuse my wording, I'm unsure of how to phrase this.
Okay, could you just, the second sentence, could you read that one more time?
The second sentence.
Yes.
How does the miseducation of the history?
No. Oh, go farther. Yeah.
Okay.
Go read the first sentence.
Earlier, it was mentioned that being is the ultimate question.
Yeah. Oh, hold it. Excuse me. I just want to say one thing. I did not say that being was the ultimate question, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think you were.
And I don't think it is even in existentialism, but go ahead.
Okay. So earlier it was mentioned that being is the ultimate question, and man cannot know himself if he did not know prior to himself.
Okay.
How does the miseducation of
Okay, let's stop right. I got it.
Okay.
I think I would just say to Hazel, there are some things that I think are a little bit confusing. For the existentialists, existence was the ultimate question. You know what I'm saying? And that is part of the agnostic, atheistic trend in existentialism, that man must take responsibility. And that's, of course, Sartre's good faith, bad faith. Yeah, so just go to the rest of it. Let me just, yeah.
the rest of it is, the second part of it is, how does the miseducation of the history of oppressed peoples delay or affect the laws of development?
Yeah, it affects them very, very strongly. And here is where the ideological struggle is so very important. People who think that ideas don't make a difference are not in touch with reality and not in touch with the reality of oppression and white supremacy. That is why billions and billions of dollars are spent on Hollywood movies. And even this idea of the artist as being above the ideological struggle. People who make such arguments obviously have never heard of Paul Robeson, or for that matter, Alice Coltrane, or Nina Simone. I mean, please. Artists have always had a responsibility not to cynically and pessimistically present what they claim is a radical reinterpretation of whatever. I mean, we are responsible to be clear and not to be cryptic and so on. So I think, what she's saying, ideas are huge, and few know it as well as Black folk because our history has been so distorted as a way of distorting us. And of course, the great James Baldwin always emphasized clarity in our understanding. And by the way, I think I just add this to Hazel's point that remember Baldwin always said, there is no Negro problem in the United States. The problem is a white problem. And that is so important and clarifying, because if it is a white problem, all of the talk of Black pathology and Black criminality and Black everything else then shifts to the causation. And the causation of all of this is anchored in the white population. And just to apply Sartre's good faith, but it is the height of bad faith for white people to act like the problem is a Black problem, because then it takes them off the hook. Yeah, they can be good liberals, but they cannot fight to change the situation until that recognition is a part of them.
We have another comment, I guess more of a reflection from Grady Lights.
Oh, okay.
He says, your answers and comments point me to this tentative conclusion. Philosophy, ideology, psychology, and religion are in their diverse expressions so many languages of life, and as such, each have their grammar for liberation.
Yeah.
The problem with their employment and deployment for the liberation of working class people is a confusion of tongues. The I guess you would say ideologizing of philosophy and vice versa, the psychologizing of religion and vice versa.
Yeah. Hold on, let me just get one thing. Now, I'm not proposing the ideologizing of philosophy, because I think they are separate, though interconnected projects. You can have ideology without philosophy, and maybe philosophy that doesn't claim to be ideological. I mean, but maybe you can challenge.
I mean, I think he's proposing that that's the problem, is that people have tried to bring in ideology in a way to, perhaps distort philosophy or psychology in a way, perhaps to confuse religion. He's saying that maybe they're the same tongue, need to be clarified.
Yeah, I think he's right. I mean, I think Heidegger is a great example of that. But then, not just Heidegger, I mean, Hegel, Kant. I mean, modern philosophy is in many, many ways shaped by the ideological conditions and ideological purposes of the philosopher. I would agree with him. And I think that the elimination of Lenin and Marx from philosophy is an ideological decision on the part of the dominant class in this society. Bois said the greatest European philosopher was Karl Marx. Of course, Du Bois is himself a philosopher, but his definition and practice of philosophy is not what most academics sitting in their, offices do. I mean, it's a kind of, it's a philosophy that, just like King, a philosopher, it's a philosophy grounded in people, in love for people. When was the last time we heard a philosopher say that my philosophy emerges from my love of the people and is committed to the struggle for freedom? I mean, maybe more of us would want to major in philosophy were that the case. Which means I have another dissertation topic for you. But, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say that's, as we've gone through systematically different, European philosophy from basically the Renaissance to the 20th century, that's something that's been missing. We haven't had a discussion about, the philosophy of love in Europe, I think because it's something, like you were saying, it's something that's not considered very important in European philosophy.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I think if they ever mention love, it's tied up again to the church and religious doctrines they're rebelling against.
Yeah. And the European notion of secularization, love is a weak kind of response to anything. And it is also, and this is another thing, we just haven't had a chance to go into every aspect of this. Kant and Hegel tie philosophy to science, particularly the natural sciences, to understanding nature and the cosmos and stuff. And so maybe what they have done, especially Hegel, has been extraordinary. But even as the existentialist, post-Russian Revolution, post-World War I, attempt to bring the human back in, they do it in a way that does not have the hope and optimism of a Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi. There is no sense of the fullness and the fullness of possibilities of the human and of human community and of human unity. It's not there. It is not there. And that's why, I know in the United States, for a lot of leftists, Martin Luther King came off as a weak reformist. I mean, what is he doing talking about love? And we're talking about class war. You know what I'm saying? But they did not understand. So yeah, I would agree. It's something missing in the conception of the human.
Right, and as we've discussed, the positions of these philosophers. I mean, their social positions, but also their civilizational, cultural positions.
Absolutely.
Predisposed to this, and when we look at the 20th century, we were talking yesterday about Yeats and others in the literary modernist movement. Essentially, it's a lot of poetry and stuff about the decline, the fall, but they're really talking about Europe as such.
Absolutely.
And I think perhaps it's similar with the existentialists. It's a sort of pessimism because for the most part, it's an inability to see beyond. I mean, the potential, the possibilities beyond. And
the inability, Joe, to see the dark world.
Right.
I mean, you get to Du Bois, and that's the starting point. And then you go to Europe, it's not even a part of the discussion. And so, we're further along than the beginning of the end, but the end is in sight.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, how do we usher in the new? This is going to be huge. And this is what we must work on. And this quick fix kind of thing, okay, you may feel good today, but in a couple of weeks, you'll be somewhere doing something else.
Right.
How do we bring about the new as the old is itself disintegrating?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I think next week we're going to get into a lot of, I know you mentioned you wanted to get into, we're going to bring in the African-American thinkers,
The
philosophers.
future.
The future, right. So I think, it's 4:15, 4:16. So now might be a good time to, I'll just share with everyone that we'll be meeting next week at the same time, 2 p.m. Sunday, May 3rd. And if there's anything you'd like to say about what we're going to do next week, or if you have any parting words.
Well, we're going to do a synthesis. What is the meaning of the futuristic orientation, the hopeful orientation, the positive orientation of African American social and ethical philosophy? Why, in the throes of the most horrible oppression, do African Americans remain the most hopeful? Now, that doesn't set the bar real high right now. And hopefully, talking about the future, we can bring in Sun Ra and Alice and John Coltrane, their visions, and to show, in a sense, how the philosophical and ideological shape and interact with the artistic and musical.
All right, great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining and for your comments. And looking forward to reconnecting with everybody next week.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Appreciate it, man.
Bye.